The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer over Seattle General's trauma bay, and Hannah Clarke moved through them like water through a sieve, present but untethered, there but somehow not quite visible. 3 years she'd worked these corridors, 3 years of double shifts and coded patience and the particular silence that comes after you've held someone's hand while the monitors flattened to a single, definitive line. Her hands were steady. That was what people noticed first. Not her face, not her name on the ID badge clipped to her scrub pocket, but her hands, fingers that never trembled during an arterial spray, fingers that could suture with the kind of precision that made surgical residents stare in confusion and envy. Dr. Marcus Mercer noticed too, and the noticing made him burn. He stood at the nurse's station in his white coat, the Johns Hopkins insignia embroidered on the pocket like a signet ring, watching Hannah work the post-op assessment on a post-appendectomy patient in bed 7. The way she palpated the abdomen, methodical, reading the tissue like a map. The way she moved the patient's arm, checking passive range of motion with the economy of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. No wasted motion. No uncertainty. Her forearms, visible beneath her rolled sleeves, showed a landscape of thin white scars, precise surgical lines, the kind you got from broken glass or shrapnel or things Mercer decided not to think about too carefully. There were stories in those marks, and Mercer hated stories he didn't control. She was just a nurse. A competent one, sure, but just a nurse. No Ivy League diploma. No research publications. No family name that opened doors at country clubs. Yet here she was, moving through his trauma bay with an authority that made him want to check her credentials again, the ones that said, what did they say, exactly? 3 years at Seattle General. Prior experience listed vaguely as field medical operations. Nothing specific. Nothing that explained why the attending surgeon sometimes deferred to her observations, why the residents watched her hands instead of focusing on Dr. Mercer's instructions. The intercom crackled overhead. Code blue, Trauma Bay 2. ETA 2 minutes. Hannah was already moving. Mercer watched her hand snap on gloves, a specific sound, rubber against skin, sharp and professional. She was gathering crash cart supplies with a precision that felt almost rehearsed, almost like muscle memory, the kind you developed in places he'd only read about in classified briefings his mentor had carelessly left on a desk. She pulled a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the supply drawer and set it precisely on the tray beside a liter of normal saline. Her badge clattered against the metal surface as she leaned forward, a small sound that seemed to echo. Mercer cleared his throat. Nurse Clarke, the crash cart protocol is my domain. Step back, please. She stepped back without hesitation. Without acknowledgement. Without meeting his eyes. That restraint was what infuriated him most. The ambulance bay doors exploded open, and a stretcher came through like a missile. A grizzled man in his mid-50s, face the color of old asphalt, medic screaming vitals. 58-year-old male, pedestrian struck by a vehicle, BP 84/52 and dropping, heart rate 142, respiratory rate 28, GCS of 8, oxygen saturation 71 and falling. Trauma Bay 2, Mercer commanded, and his team moved like they'd practiced this in their sleep, which they had. The patient transfer was chaos organized into 10-second intervals. The patient's Army Ranger tattoo was visible on his neck, faded green ink spelling out a unit designation that meant nothing to Mercer, meant everything to Hannah, who'd seen it and looked away precisely as fast as a civilian nurse should have. The trauma bay erupted into the controlled violence of emergency medicine. Monitors screaming. Orders being issued. Hannah working the full line while a surgical resident positioned the patient for primary survey assessment. Mercer directed the thoracic ultrasound, barking instructions about pneumothorax protocol, about whether they'd need a needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. His hands moved confidently. Ivy League confidence. The confidence of someone who'd never had to improvise with a combat knife and a dying soldier bleeding out in a Humvee. The patient's eyes fluttered open for half a second, and he locked onto Hannah's hands as she adjusted the oxygen mask. His lips moved. No sound. But his eyes stayed on her fingers, on the way she positioned the mask with anatomical precision, on the scars mapping her forearms like coordinates. He whispered something to the orderly beside him, something too quiet for Mercer to hear over the monitor screams. "Reckon cut," the orderly said, and then looked confused about why he'd said it aloud. Hannah didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge. Just continued with the work, steady, methodical, the hands of someone who'd done this before, somewhere, under conditions that Mercer's Johns Hopkins training had only prepared him to their eyes about. 3 years she'd worked trauma at Seattle General, and Mercer had decided 3 years ago that he couldn't stand her. The decision had nothing to do with her clinical competence and everything to do with the fact that her clinical competence seemed to come from a place he couldn't quantify, couldn't demean, couldn't control. So he'd begun the careful work of observation, of notation, of the kind of institutional pressure that could be applied quietly, through proper channels, with plausible deniability. He'd mentioned to the chief of surgery that her credentials seemed incomplete. He'd suggested during a staff meeting that some of her assessment techniques seemed unconventional. He'd made sure that when the patient care committee reviewed her file, they'd focus on the vagueness of field medical operations instead of the fact that she'd never made a single clinical error, had never lost a patient who could have been saved, had moved through 3 years of trauma nursing like someone who'd already survived the worst the world could offer. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she wouldn't fight back. The worst part was that she took every subtle slight, every whispered doubt, every carefully documented concern with the same steady composure she brought to a dying patient. No defensive email. No complaint to human resources. No tears in the break room where the younger nurses whispered. Just silence, punctuated by the sound of her working. The monitors beeped their mechanical rhythm. O2 climbing. 68, 74. 81, the patient's blood pressure stabilized. Mercer made the decision to admit to intensive care, to call surgery for imaging, to implement the protocol exactly as he'd outlined it. It would work. His protocols always worked. But somewhere in the back of his mind, he was already thinking about the next meeting, the next opportunity to suggest that perhaps someone with such unconventional training might not be suitable for a prestigious institution like Seattle General. Hannah was already restocking the crash cart. Her movements fluid. Her expression blank. She pulled fresh gloves from the box and moved toward the post-op patient in bed 7, ready to complete the assessment Mercer had interrupted. He watched her go, and he didn't see the silver star citation folded in plastic in her locker. He didn't see the names of 16 soldiers etched into her memory like coordinates. He didn't see that the reason her hands never shook was because she'd held hands through worse, much worse, in places where the sand was red and the silence after a firefight sounded like the end of the world. He saw only a competent nurse he could diminish. And he was about to learn what happened when you tried to break someone who'd already been broken and rebuilt by the kind of fire that turns glass into diamonds. Dr. Mercer's campaign began the next morning when Hannah entered the surgical suite and found him addressing the resident team like a conductor before an orchestra. "Ah, Nurse No Credentials joins us," he announced, his voice dripping condescension thick as honey poured over broken glass. The residents exchanged glances, uncomfortable, uncertain whether to laugh or look away. Hannah set her instrument tray down with precise, measured movements. Not a tremor. Not a flinch. "The suturing technique you're demonstrating, doctor, the closure pattern on the deltoid, that's actually compromising the fascia integrity," she said quietly, her tone conversational, factual. She stepped forward and pointed to his work with one steady finger. "Military field protocol uses subcuticular running suture here. Faster. Cleaner. Better scar outcome for the patient." She looked directly at Mrs. Patterson, the woman whose shoulder Mercer had just begun to close. "You'll have less restriction of motion with a proper technique." The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm from the ICU down the hall. Mercer's face flushed, not embarrassment, but rage, the kind that comes from a man unaccustomed to correction, especially not in front of an audience. He set his instruments down slowly, deliberately, like a predator sizing up a threat. "I appreciate the unsolicited expertise, Hannah. Perhaps next time you could share your YouTube findings during break." A few residents laughed, nervous, uncertain laughter, the kind that exists only because someone with authority had given permission. Hannah didn't respond. She simply moved to Mrs. Patterson's other side and began prepping the secondary incision site. The message was clearer than any argument: she'd move forward. He could choose to be useful or be irrelevant. That was the moment he decided to destroy her. By noon, Mercer was in the chief administrator's office, closing the door with the quiet certainty of a man who'd orchestrated this conversation months in advance. He'd done his homework: emails to the board about unverified credentials, casual conversations with senior physicians about her unusual background, carefully planted questions about her licensing verification. "I'm just concerned," he told Administrator Hayes, his voice pitched low with the false gravity of someone protecting the hospital's reputation, "about gaps in her employment history. The dates don't align. I've worked with her for 3 years and never seen traditional nursing school transcripts. Has anyone actually verified her qualifications?" Hayes leaned back in his chair, uncertainty flickering across his face. That was all Mercer needed. Doubt, once planted, grows like infection. The schedule changes came next. Hannah's rotation shifted from standard day shifts, predictable, manageable, to a nightmare carousel of swing shifts designed to shred her circadian rhythm and performance. Monday through Wednesday, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. Thursday and Friday, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. Saturday, back to days. Her body couldn't adjust. Her hands, which had been steady through 1,000 procedures, began to show the tremor of exhaustion, though she masked it with iron discipline. More than that, her most competent nursing partners, the ones who could anticipate her movements and support her in crisis, were quietly reassigned to other units. Mercer replaced them with first-year nurses fresh from orientation, competent in theory but paralyzed by uncertainty in actual trauma situations. The break room incident came on a Thursday morning. Hannah sat alone with her coffee, the chair across from her empty, and watched as every nurse who entered found an urgent reason to leave within 30 seconds. Maria, who'd worked alongside her for 2 years and knew her clinical instincts were flawless, suddenly remembered a medication she needed to check. Torres mumbled something about a patient needing wound care and disappeared. Even Chen, who Hannah had trained during her first month, couldn't meet her eyes. Within 90 seconds, the fluorescent lights hummed down over an empty room except for Hannah, her coffee cooling in front of her, and the unspoken message that associating with her had become dangerous. She didn't flinch. She sat there for 5 more minutes, sipped her coffee, then returned to work. Mercer was busy, always busy, his intelligence network spreading like a web through the hospital's administrative structure. An email to Johns Hopkins, carefully worded: "We have an excellent nurse on staff, but some questions have arisen regarding her background credentials that I thought you should be aware of before she potentially seeks a position in your system." Another conversation with the chief of surgery, planting concerns about procedural irregularities that he'd witnessed but couldn't quite document. A suggestion to the board that perhaps a full credentialing audit should be conducted, just to be safe. Each move was surgical, precise, deniable, impossible to prove was orchestrated with malicious intent. He was simply doing his job. Simply protecting the institution. The public write-up appeared on the unit board Monday morning, and it was the first moment Hannah understood she was being hunted. Hannah Clarke, formal citation for insubordination. The red marker screamed, the letters thick and aggressive, impossible to miss. The citation detailed her unauthorized correction of attending physician Dr. Mercer during a surgical procedure, her failure to maintain appropriate hierarchical communication, her pattern of questioning clinical decisions made by senior staff. At the bottom, further violations of protocol will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. Her name was written in letters large enough that every staff member passing through the unit would read it and wonder what she'd done. She stood in front of the board at 6:19 a.m., before the morning shift formally began, and read every word. Junior nurses shuffled past, their eyes deliberately averted, the way people look away from car accidents they don't want to acknowledge. One of them, a girl named Santos, barely 23, who Hannah had mentored through her first month in trauma, slowed as she walked by. Hannah caught her eye. Just a glance. Santos kept moving. That was when Hannah felt it, not fear, not anger, but the particular exhaustion of a person who'd been broken and rebuilt by fire so intense it had turned her into something harder than diamond, and even that wasn't enough to survive peacetime bureaucracy. Across the hall, in the pre-op area, a grizzled Army Ranger named Corporal James Rivera was being prepped for elective kidney stone surgery, a minor procedure, routine, the kind of case a surgeon like Mercer used to sharpen his confidence. Rivera was 63, with the kind of weathered face that told stories of places most people would never understand. His eyes were pale blue, the color of sky before a storm. As Hannah passed his stretcher, still reading and rereading the write-up on the unit board, something in her movements caught his attention. The way she walked. The way her hands hung at her sides with the particular precision of someone trained in crisis medicine. The scar tissue visible on her left wrist. The calluses on her palms. He nudged his buddy, an older guy named Clayton who'd served 2 units over with him back in 2009. "That's a combat medic's cut," Rivera whispered, his voice like gravel in a truck bed, nodding toward Hannah's wrists where her scrub sleeves had pulled back. "I'd know that needle work anywhere. Seen hands like that in Kandahar. Girl who pulled 3 of us out under Taliban fire." Clayton told him to shut up. They were heading into surgery, but Rivera kept watching. His pale eyes tracked her down the hallway with the recognition of a soldier who understands the particular composure that only comes from having held a dying man in your arms while rounds were coming in. She didn't know he was watching. She didn't know that somewhere in this hospital, someone recognized what she'd buried so carefully that even she'd almost forgotten it herself. Hannah's shift that day began with impossible patient loads. 6 trauma admissions in 4 hours, each one complex, each one demanding the kind of attention and precision that required more than one person's hands and mind. Mercer had orchestrated it. She would later piece together the timing, scheduling her as the primary trauma nurse for cases typically handled by 2 people working in tandem. The pressure was designed to break her. Too many patients, too little support, too many decisions happening at the speed of crisis. He'd watch her fail. He'd document it. He'd have his justification. She worked through lunch. Didn't eat. Didn't sit. Her hands moved with mechanical precision from one bed to another, drawing labs, running fluids, monitoring vitals, talking patients through procedures, coordinating with physicians while maintaining the particular brand of calm that comes from having trained in environments where panic meant people died. By 4 p.m., her feet ached in a way that suggested her body was ready to simply stop functioning. By 6 p.m., when her shift technically ended, she was still in Bay 3, managing a critical patient who'd coded twice. It was 7:15 when she finally made it to her locker. The small space smelled like antiseptic and worn fabric. She sat on the bench and stared at nothing for exactly 3 minutes. Then she opened the lower shelf, moved aside her spare scrubs, and pulled out the plastic-wrapped package she hadn't looked at in 18 months. The flag. Folded in the precise military triangle, the fold so tight and perfect they looked like they'd been cut from cardboard. Not the American flag, the combat patch from her unit. Colors muted by time and desert sun. In her hands, it weighed almost nothing. In her chest, it weighed like a stone. She could see it again if she closed her eyes, the moment they'd pulled her from active duty in Tikrit, the Pentagon liaison explaining that her operation would be classified, her records erased, her identity officially deceased. "Captain Hannah Clarke," he'd said, his voice clinical and distant, "no longer exists. You'll be provided with civilian credentials. New background. New name. You will never speak about what happened in Tikrit. You will never identify yourself as military. You will never contact anyone from your unit. If you do, we'll know, and the consequences will extend to your family." She'd saluted. Folded her uniform. Became a nurse named Hannah with a fabricated employment history and hands that knew how to save lives but couldn't ever explain how she'd learned. 6 years of silence. 6 years of moving through the world as less than she actually was, correcting a surgeon's technique and being punished for it, reading her name in red marker on a unit board, watching nurses she'd trained avoid her gaze. 6 years of being invisible. The next morning, when Hannah arrived for her shift, the unit board still bore her name in angry red letters. She read it again, the words exactly the same as yesterday, permanent as a scar. She took one measured breath. Felt one tear trace her cheek, not from pain, but from the exhaustion of always having to prove herself to people whose worst day would never approach the reality of her normal Tuesday. She wiped her face without breaking composure and turned to find Dr. Mercer standing 5 feet away, arms crossed, waiting for her reaction. "You mistake silence for weakness, Doctor," Hannah said quietly, her voice dropping an octave lower than her normal speech pattern, the particular tone of someone who'd given orders in chaos and expected them to be followed. "I've buried men braver than you'll ever be. Men who'd laugh at whatever this is." She gestured toward the write-up with one steady hand. "So we can continue this if you want. But understand what you're actually doing. You're not breaking a nurse. You're just reminding me who I used to be." The room went dead silent. Mercer's face flushed crimson, not confidence, but the rage of a man realizing he'd miscalculated. He opened his mouth to respond, but Hannah had already turned away, her posture unchanged, her shoulders settled, her hands steady. The mask wasn't slipping. It was transforming. The deferential nurse was beginning to reveal itself as something far more dangerous, someone trained by the kind of fire that doesn't leave scars. It leaves warriors. And he'd just made the mistake of challenging one. Mercer moved fast after that, faster than Hannah expected. The next morning, her assignment sheet was already rewritten. Gone was Martinez, the trauma specialist who'd worked beside her for 2 years with the kind of seamless coordination that only came from combat experience. Gone was Chen, whose steady hands had assisted on every successful resuscitation in her rotation. In their place, Torres, fresh from nursing school 3 months ago, still checking the medication charts twice before administering anything. And Kowalski, hired just 6 weeks prior, who'd contaminated a sterile field twice in a single shift. It wasn't incompetence Mercer was installing. It was isolation wearing scrubs. Hannah studied the new assignment without expression, but her jaw tightened, a single muscle twitch that took a full 3 seconds to release. The schedule underneath was worse. Third shift paired with day shift overlap created a 17-hour stretch that left her without a proper break, her body forced into the kind of fatigue that erodes judgment. Nights paired with morning rounds meant sleeping 0 hours between shifts. It was tactical. It was deliberate. It was Mercer applying the same methodology he'd learned from his Johns Hopkins mentors, not a frontal assault, but a systematic dismantling of operational capacity. He was treating her like a hostile asset to be neutralized through administrative procedure rather than direct confrontation. The break room went silent the moment she entered on day 3. She didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge the sudden absence of conversation. She simply poured her coffee, black, no sugar, hand steady as a surgical laser, while 4 junior nurses gathered their things and shuffled toward the door. One of them, a girl named Simmons who couldn't have been more than 24, knocked a styrofoam cup off the counter trying to exit faster. It clattered across the tile, coffee pooling like a wound. Simmons didn't clean it up. She just left. Hannah set her own cup down and wiped the spill with paper towels, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects trapped in amber. Nobody came back for 3 hours. When they did, they waited until she left before sitting down. The emails started arriving in her personal hospital inbox, not aggressive, not overtly damaging, but crafted with the precision of someone building a case before a jury. Concerns regarding Nurse Clarke's procedural compliance in the post-op ward. CSIT to Hospital Administrator, Chief Nursing Officer, Quality Assurance Director. Another one followed, potential irregularities noted during medication administration protocols. CSIT to the same recipients, plus the risk management team. Each email contained no actual accusation, just implications wrapped in bureaucratic language. We should discuss instead of she violated. Concerns have been raised instead of she did this. It was the equivalent of poisoning a well while maintaining plausible deniability, one carefully chosen phrase at a time. Hannah understood immediately. Mercer wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He was building a narrative. By the time these emails circulated through enough departments, people would stop asking for evidence and start assuming guilt. Her building access changed on day 4. The magnetic key card that opened the staff entrance, the one marked authorized personnel only, no longer worked at 11:24 p.m. when she tried to enter for her shift. She stood in the parking lot staring at the red LED light while rain began to fall, each drop hitting the asphalt with a sound like distant gunfire. She had to walk around to the main entrance, check in with security, wait while they verified her identity against a new access list. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes that cut into charting time, into preparation, into the small margins where competence happens. Security guard named Peterson looked uncomfortable. New administrative protocol, he said, not meeting her eyes. Director's orders. It wasn't new. It was just her. Hannah nodded and moved forward without a word, but the message was clear: she was being systematically excluded from normal pathways. Everything now required supervision. Everything now created a paper trail. That was when she understood the full scope of what Mercer had constructed. It wasn't just about making her look bad anymore. It was about making her fail. By separating her from experienced staff, fragmenting her schedule into biological impossibility, cutting her off from normal access routes, and flooding administration with insinuation, he was engineering the conditions where someone eventually makes a mistake. And when that mistake happened, and it would happen because exhaustion compounds error, every decision she'd made would be scrutinized through the lens of the narrative he'd already planted. She would fail not because she was incompetent, but because he'd created an environment designed to break anyone functioning within it. 2 days before the crisis, Hannah opened her locker during a break between shifts. The hospital maintenance staff had cleaned out old items per standard protocol, and everything had been reorganized. But someone, maybe Peterson, maybe a custodian with more decency than administration deserved, had carefully wrapped the plastic container and placed it front and center. Inside, folded with military precision, was the flag from Tikrit. The nylon had faded from deep red to a rust color that looked like dried blood. The creases were still sharp from the way she'd packed it 6 years ago, right before the exfiltration, right before she'd become invisible, right before she'd become Hannah Clarke, civilian nurse. She held it without touching the fabric, just the plastic, and the weight of it felt like physics, like gravity itself had increased by some measurable amount. On the folds of that flag was the ghost of her teammate, the Army Ranger she'd held in her hands as rounds punched through the medic bag, as his breathing became labored, as the sand beneath them turned dark. She'd kept him alive for 43 minutes past the point where any hospital would have called it. She'd kept him alive through 2 kilometers of extraction, through the helicopter doors opening, through the final moment when his eyes found hers and stopped searching. The Pentagon had given her the flag afterward. The same Pentagon that said she had to disappear. The same Pentagon that told her to burn her records, move to civilian life, become someone else entirely. She closed the locker and stood in the empty room, fluorescent light buzzing like a warning, 6 years of enforced anonymity sitting in her chest like shrapnel. Mercer had no idea what he was about to encounter. None of them did. They saw a nurse being systematically dismantled. They saw successful administrative sabotage playing out across email chains and schedule changes and building access restrictions. But in 2 days, a code blue alarm would shriek through the ICU. A patient would arrive with no identification. And Hannah Clarke, Captain Hannah Clarke, who'd kept 17 soldiers alive under fire in Tikrit, who'd carried wounded men across open ground while bullets painted the air, would have to decide whether 6 years of invisibility were worth preserving when someone's life depended on her hands moving the way they'd been trained. The code blue alarm shrieks through the ICU at 9:16 p.m., a sound like a jet engine spooling up in a confined space. The monitor above bed 14 flatlines into one long, accusatory wail. Blood pressure 90/60 and falling. Heart rhythm erratic. The man has been unconscious since paramedics brought him in 2 hours ago. No wallet, no phone, no identification, just a body in a torn shirt and a chart that says unknown male, approx age 42. Security finds the dog tags tangled in his twisted collar during triage. Corporal James Rivera, Army Ranger. The tag number gets logged. The name means nothing to anyone in that moment because the monitors are screaming and the ceiling is white and nobody is thinking about who this man is. They're thinking about whether he'll still be breathing in 3 minutes. Dr. Mercer hears the alarm from the physician's lounge. He sets down his coffee, rises from his chair with the practiced slowness of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room, and walks toward the ICU. His shoes click against the floor. His white coat is pristine. His expression is already arranged into one of controlled confidence. He arrives at the bedside. He sees the monitors. He sees the nurse who should have been maintaining the 4-line already moving, already running, already barking orders like she owns the room. Hannah Clarke. The woman he's spent 3 months dismantling. The woman who corrected his suturing. The woman who was supposed to break by now. Dr. Mercer stops. He steps backward. Hannah doesn't notice. Hannah is already 5 steps ahead of his brain. The crash cart is beside the bed, defibrillator pads on Rivera's bare chest, but the rhythm is wrong and the pads aren't connecting right because the man's shirt is soaked in something, sweat, blood, the fluids of a body in revolt. Hannah rips the pads away with movements that have no hesitation in them. No second guessing. No moment of should I. She has a job. The job is survival. Everything else is noise. Stand back, she says, her voice flat and absolute. It isn't a request. It was a command delivered in the tone of someone who'd given commands before, in places where commands meant the difference between people walking out or being carried out. 2 residents jump backward. A nurse stumbles. The crash cart lurches as Hannah pushes it closer to the bed, closer to Rivera's failing body. The defibrillator charges. 200 joules. The sound it makes is like a camera flash powered by electricity and desperation. Rivera's body convulses. The monitor spikes, falls, returns to chaos. Blood pressure still dropping. 85/40. His heart is drowning in his own chest. Hannah grabs a scalpel from the overhead tray. Not the crash cart scalpel. The surgical scalpel. The one meant for precision work in controlled environments. She doesn't have controlled anything. She has a man whose heart is stopping and a decision that lives in the gap between protocol and keeping someone alive. She makes the choice her hands already know how to make. The incision goes from his sternum down and lateral, angled like muscle memory written in blood and training, right there in the ICU with fluorescent lights and monitors and other people's shock turning the air thick. 1 cut. The ribs are below, white bone beneath red tissue. She needs to open that cage. Rib spreader, she says. Nobody moves. The room is holding its breath. Rib spreader. Now. A resident shoves one into her waiting hand. Hannah positions it between the ribs, that precise space she's only practiced on models and in dreams for 6 years, and pulls. The sound is like cracking wood, like the body surrendering because the alternative is worse. The ribs separate. The space opens. She can see the heart now, that fist-sized muscle, purple and struggling, beating wrong. Her hands move into that cavity with the precision of someone who's done this before. Not in a hospital. Not with proper anesthesia and surgical lighting. In the red dust of Tikrit, in a blown-out building, with a corpsman yelling distances and a second lieutenant bleeding out and 17 soldiers waiting to move because this one's not leaving without him. Hannah finds the heart. Her hand wraps around it. She begins compressions, manual, direct, counting in her head without moving her lips. 30 compressions. The monitor watching. 60. The EKG tracing a rhythm that's almost catching. Epi, 1 milligram 4, she says between compressions. Someone pushes the epinephrine. She can feel it, the drug hitting the bloodstream, that chemical kick to the electrical system of the heart. Again. The monitors beep. Once. Twice. Sinus rhythm. The 2 residents, 3rd-year surgical residents, the kind with Ivy League credentials and board scores that predicted their futures, they're just staring. Not at the save. At Hannah's hands. At the way her fingers moved in that chest cavity, like they were reading Braille written in anatomy, like she was reading something in the language of wounds and survival that they don't speak yet. One of them pulls out his phone. He's recording. Not for social media. For the research. For the mystery of how a nurse just saved a life using wartime combat medicine in the middle of a sterile hospital. Hannah doesn't see the phone. She's already looking at blood pressure climbing. 103/58. Climbing. Her hands are soaked red. Her scrubs are going to need bleach. Her pulse is normal. Her breathing is normal. She looks like someone who just performed a field thoracotomy with her bare hands and a scalpel in an intensive care unit and is now wondering if she needs coffee. Dr. Mercer is still standing 3 feet away from the bed, his mouth slightly open, his white coat pristine and untouched. He watched Hannah Clarke save a man's life by breaking every protocol he spent the last 3 months trying to enforce. He watched her move with a precision that made his Ivy League training look like a child's drawing of medicine. He watched her succeed by doing exactly what he would never allow. His hand goes to his pocket. His phone is there. He pulls it out. His fingers are already moving before his brain catches up, already dialing the number he got from a board member 3 weeks ago. The administrative line. The one that logs complaints. The one that matters. He walks away from the bed, away from Hannah, away from a man whose heart is beating because a nurse just cracked open his ribs with nothing but training and muscle memory. He walks toward the window where the conversation can be quiet. Private. Deniable. I need to report an incident of unauthorized medical procedure, he says into the phone. His voice is steady. Controlled. The voice of someone making a complaint that will sound perfectly reasonable to people who weren't in that room. A nurse in our ICU performed an emergency thoracotomy without physician authorization. Clear protocol violation. Potential patient endangerment. The person on the other end is already typing. They're already writing down his name, the date, the time, the accusation. By the time Mercer hangs up, the complaint is in the system. Anonymous report, filed by administration, serious allegations, requires immediate investigation. Security will be called. The nurse will be removed from the floor. The case will be reviewed. And by the time anyone gets around to asking whether the procedure actually saved the patient's life, the narrative will already be set in stone. Mercer looks back toward bed 14. Hannah is washing her hands at the sink, the water running red, her face showing nothing. No triumph. No fear. No reaction at all to the fact that she just performed a miracle and destroyed her own career with the same 2 hands. The evening shift supervisor is already heading toward her. He's already got that expression that says he's about to deliver bad news. Mercer watches from across the ICU as Hannah hears the words. Unauthorized procedure. Investigation required. Building access suspended pending review. She needs to surrender her badge now. Tonight. Security will escort her to her locker. Hannah nods. She dries her hands. She doesn't cry. She doesn't speak. She does exactly what any professional does when the system turns against them, she complies. She removes the badge from her lanyard. She hands it to the supervisor. She turns toward the locker room without looking back at bed 14, where James Rivera's heart is now beating a steady, perfect rhythm that wouldn't exist without the hands that just saved him. By the time Rivera wakes up, she'll be gone. By the time he asks about the woman who cracked his ribs and brought him back, she'll be erased. No name in the chart. No record of who performed the procedure, just a note that the patient received emergency surgical intervention by nursing staff. The system protects itself. The system protects doctors. The system does not protect women who know too much. That evening, as the shift ends and the hospital lights shift toward the fluorescent night hum, Mercer moves through the floor like a general consolidating territory. He reassigns every nurse who was in the ICU during the code, scatters them across different shifts, different departments, pulls them out of the gossip channels before they can create a narrative about what they witnessed. He calls his mentor at Johns Hopkins, mentions casually that one of their traveler nurses had an incident, something about unauthorized procedures, probably not someone you want to consider if she applies. His mentor says he'll make a call to the credentialing committee just in case. By morning, Hannah Clarke's professional reputation will have been poisoned in 3 separate hospital networks. But that isn't the worst part. That evening, at 11:34 p.m., Hannah returns to collect her final paycheck. She walks into the employee laundry room where the surgical scrubs are stored in bins, and she finds her last pair, the one she wore today, now soaked and waiting for the industrial washer. She picks them up with both hands. The fabric is stiff with dried blood. It smells like antiseptic and copper and the ghost of Rivera's dying body that she brought back to living. She folds them. Right side to left. Collar to hem. The way she was trained, the way her hands know how to do it without thinking. One fold, then another. Parade ground precision. Each crease exactly parallel. She's done this 1,000 times in 1,000 barracks and forward operating bases where your uniform means everything because it's sometimes the only thing keeping you alive. She places the folded scrubs into the bin for cleaning. She turns. She walks toward the parking lot. Her body feels like it belongs to someone else now, someone who was a nurse for 3 years and a captain for 6 years and something in between that nobody's allowed to name anymore. The rain is falling in San Antonio tonight, cold and angry, and Hannah Clarke walks through it without an umbrella, letting it soak through her jacket, letting it wash the blood from under her fingernails. She doesn't feel it. She doesn't feel much of anything except the weight of the thing she's been carrying in her locker for 6 years, the folded flag from Tikrit, from the teammate whose name she's not allowed to speak, from the operation that was supposed to be classified forever. She doesn't know that in bed 14, James Rivera is waking up. She doesn't know that his first conscious thought is about the hands that saved him. She doesn't know that one word is already forming on his lips, a call sign from a different lifetime, a name that's about to bring her entire hidden world crashing down in the most public way possible. Within the hour, the hospital board received an anonymous report. Unauthorized procedures. Protocol violations. A name circled in red, Hannah Clarke. The email came from Dr. Mercer's personal account, sent at 11:08 a.m., before Rivera's eyes even flickered open. Security was already moving when she emerged from the locker room in street clothes, her scrubs folded in a canvas bag, her badge still clipped to her waistband like a phantom limb she couldn't quite remove. "Ms. Clarke." The security guard's voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "We're going to need you to come with us." She didn't ask questions. She didn't argue. She walked beside him through the corridor, the same corridor where she'd run codes, where she'd whispered encouragement to patients whose families weren't allowed to see them, where her hands had moved with the precision of someone who'd learned medicine under fire and kept that knowledge buried for 6 years. Nurses watched from doorways, their eyes tracking her like she was already a ghost. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in the hospital white that makes tragedy look sterile, makes disaster look administrative. By noon, every nurse who'd witnessed the thoracotomy had been reassigned. The trauma unit suddenly looked like a skeleton crew. Rodriguez transferred to pediatrics. Washington moved to the night shift in a satellite clinic 15 miles away. Chen was reassigned to administrative paperwork. Not fired. Just scattered. Not fired meant the board had plausible deniability. Just reassigned meant Mercer had covered his tracks with the precision of a man who'd practiced institutional sabotage the way other men practiced their golf swing. Her building access card was deactivated before she got home. She found out when she tried to swipe in the next morning, muscle memory made her reach for the turnstile before remembering she'd been escorted out like a patient leaving AMA, against medical advice, which was exactly what this was. The system rejected her with a soft beep that sounded like a door closing. Permanently. Mercer was already on the phone to Johns Hopkins. She wouldn't learn about this call until much later, until the whole architecture of his villainy was exposed and laid bare. But in that moment, at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, he was speaking to Dr. Patricia Chen, Dean of Medicine, the woman who'd trained him 15 years ago, the mentor who'd written the recommendations that built his career like a structure of stacked credentials and borrowed authority. Patricia, I need to inform you of a situation developing here. One of our nurses, former nurses of today, represented herself with credentials we cannot verify. She performed unauthorized procedures that could have endangered patient lives. I wanted you to know in case she attempts to transfer or seek employment in academic medicine. Her background is murky. Very murky. I'd hate to see this incident repeated elsewhere. The poison was delivered with surgical precision. Not a direct accusation. Just questions. Just concerns. Just the kind of doubt that sticks to a person's record like blood under fingernails and can never quite be scrubbed clean. That evening, Hannah returned her scrubs to the hospital laundry. She'd taken them home one last time, washed them herself even though that wasn't protocol, even though it didn't matter anymore. The fabric still held the smell of antiseptic and the invisible residue of 6 years of saving lives in a system that had decided she was a threat. She folded each piece with parade ground precision, the discipline so ingrained it was automatic now, muscle memory that would never leave her body. The blue cotton felt heavier than it should, weighted down with the knowledge that she'd saved a man and it had cost her everything. She pressed the creases sharp enough to cut skin, her movements mechanical, her jaw working against the silence of her apartment. Rain hammered the windows outside, the kind of rain that comes to cities in summer, sudden and furious and then gone. She folded the last piece, a surgical cap, and placed it on top of the stack. Tomorrow she'd return them. Tonight, she just sat in the dark with the weight of it all pressing down like the pressure of 2 atmospheres at depth, the point where your body starts to crush under the weight of water that's been above you all along. In ICU Bay 7, James Rivera's eyes opened at 3:52 a.m. His chest was wrapped in surgical tape and gauze. Monitors hummed their steady rhythm around him. His throat was dry from the breathing tube they'd extubated 4 hours ago, and the first thing his eyes did was search for the hands that had saved his life. Not Mercer's hands. Not the resident's hands. The hands that had cracked his ribs like they were opening a door to somewhere beyond death, that had reached inside his chest and held his heart literally in her palms while commanding the room like a general in the field. Through the glass partition of his room, he saw her standing in the hallway. Just standing there. Hannah Clarke, hands at her sides, looking at him with eyes that had seen things no civilian should ever see, eyes that knew exactly what survival cost. One word formed on his lips, whispered through the thickness of recovery and anesthesia and the fog of having died and come back. A call sign from a different lifetime. A name that belonged to a woman he'd served with in the Sanjin Valley of Helmand Province, a combat medic who'd pulled 17 soldiers out of a firefight in Tikrit while taking rounds through her body armor, who'd kept moving even after her leg was shot, who'd whispered to dying men that it was going to be okay even when it wasn't. Reaper. The word hung in the air like a grenade that had already detonated in slow motion. A Marine colonel was standing 30 feet down the corridor, waiting for coffee from the break room vending machine. He heard it. One word. That single syllable seemed to compress the air around him. He went pale in the way that only men go pale when they've just heard the name of someone who's supposed to be dead, someone who's supposed to be erased, someone whose file is classified so high that saying her name out loud is supposed to be impossible. He walked to Rivera's doorway and his hands were shaking when he pulled up his phone. 2 minutes later, he was reading from a citation he'd found in a secure database that required 3 levels of authentication to access. His voice started low and rose with each word, each sentence climbing like an airplane that's trying to reach altitude in a thunderstorm. Captain Hannah Clarke. Silver Star recipient. Tikrit Operation, 2014. 17 soldiers extracted under fire. His voice cracked on the next line. Despite severe wounds, maintained command and medical support through 18 hours of continuous combat operations. Mercer appeared in the ICU entrance, drawn by the sudden elevation in intensity, and when he saw the citation displayed on the Marine's phone, something shifted in his face. He smiled, a thin, awful smile, and his voice came out like gravel in a disposal. Stolen valor. The words landed like he'd spit them. That's what happens when you let these stories run wild. Half the nurses in this hospital probably have some fantasy background. A 2-star general was standing 10 feet away. She'd been checking on a veteran from her base, a routine visit, nothing more. But when she turned and saw the scars on Hannah's forearms, thin white lines that told the story of shrapnel and blast waves and the particular way shattered metal cuts through skin, she didn't need the citation or the Marine colonel's trembling voice. She snapped to attention. Not casually. Not as a gesture. She moved into the posture with the kind of reverence reserved for the highest decoration, the kind of salute that comes from the deepest bone marrow of respect. Nurses ran. From 3 units over, from the charge station, from the supply closet and the medication room, they came when they saw a 2-star general render a salute in the middle of Seattle General's ICU. Something had shifted in the universe. The air pressure had changed. The hierarchy that had seemed so fixed, so absolute, was cracking. A Pentagon liaison was called. While Mercer stood rooted to the spot, his smile collapsing like a structure that had lost its foundation, the liaison confirmed Hannah's code name over speakerphone. The designation was so classified that the hospital administrator physically stepped backward when he heard it, his body making the retreat his mind was still processing. Clearance level. Compartmentalized information. Restricted access. Everything that meant this woman had operated in circles that existed somewhere above the normal structure of military medicine, somewhere beyond the reach of institutional power plays and credential questioning. Someone recorded it. Not consciously. Not as a plan. But a junior resident's phone was already out, capturing the moment when Mercer's face went from arrogant to hollow, from smiling to silent, from a man with institutional power to a man who'd just realized he'd spent the last week trying to destroy someone the government itself had buried. The video went up at 6:17 p.m. By noon the next day, it had 2 million views. By evening, it was on national news. The image was perfect, devastating in its composition. A decorated war hero, silver-haired, composed, standing in a hospital corridor while a physician mocked her service. The comment sections filled with veterans recognizing her call sign, with soldiers who'd heard stories about the medic who wouldn't leave her people, with people who understood what it meant that she'd been erased and was now visible again. Dr. Patricia Chen, Dean of Medicine at Johns Hopkins, saw the footage at 7:41 a.m. the next morning. She recognized Mercer immediately. She watched him sneer. She watched him use the word stolen. And then she did something that would end him. She issued a public statement. The physician in this video does not represent the values of our institution. I personally trained Dr. Mercer and am appalled by his treatment of a Silver Star recipient. Effective immediately, I am requesting a full review of his credentials and conduct. The disavowal was weaponized immediately. By 11 a.m., the hospital board had called an emergency session. By 1 p.m., they'd pulled 6 months of Mercer's emails. The calculated campaign unfurled like a map of calculated cruelty. The strategic reassignments. The preemptive calls to other hospitals. The emails CCing administration about Hannah's murky background. The workup memo requesting credential verification of a woman whose credentials had been classified by the Department of Defense. It was all there. Every move. Every calculated strike. Every small sabotage documented and timestamped and witnessed by people whose only crime had been watching. Mercer's office was emptied while he sat in his car in the parking lot, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. His phone buzzed with notifications. Colleagues cutting ties. Surgical conferences uninviting him. Journals quietly retracting 3 papers he'd published, citing ethical concerns in research conduct. The infrastructure he'd built to contain Hannah had become his own prison. By Friday, the hospital board voted unanimously, immediate suspension, credential review, termination proceedings. The state medical board opened a formal investigation. 6 months later, after the proceedings concluded, after the testimony and the evidence and the ultimate stripping of his surgical privileges, Dr. Mercer would drive a white medical supply van with the Seattle General logo across San Antonio, delivering gauze rolls and bedpans to satellite clinics, his hand steady on the wheel but his eyes hollow with the particular emptiness of a man who'd miscalculated the cost of his own ambition. But first, he had to live through the present moment. He had to watch the hospital administrator personally call Hannah Clarke to offer not just reinstatement, but a promotion. He had to know that the woman he'd spent a week destroying had been operating in a clearance level he could never access, had been trained by institutions he could never join, had been honored by a government that had buried her name to protect her identity. He tried to break someone who'd already survived the worst that war could offer. He'd used institutional weapons against a woman who'd earned her composure in places where mistakes meant dead soldiers and live with that knowledge forever. And now everyone knew. Subscribe to hear how Hannah's story continues. Like this video if you believe truth and honor triumph over institutional corruption. Comment below, what would you have done in Hannah's position?